In 1962, as you see here, the Supreme Court of the United States decided an important case. The court held that the regent's prayer violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. From thenceforward, school children in New York State, like you see here, would no longer be asked to bow their heads as their teacher led them in daily exercise of prayer. Engel against Vitale pitted the parents of a small group of school children on Long Island against the machinery of the Empire State. Holding that the parents had the better understanding of the rights of American citizens, the Supreme Court said, and here I'm quoting, "It is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people to recite as part of a religious program carried on by government." In the early 1960s, the Supreme Court was embroiled in other aspects of public education, too, especially in a long and painful effort to dismantle the laws that undergirded Jim Crow. Starting in the 1940s and continuing late into the 20th and early 21st century, federal courts were involved in enforcing Brown against Board of Education. School districts around the country found themselves under the scrutiny of the judicial branch of our national government. It's never a good feeling to be interesting to a judge. The mandate for integration of public education had far-reaching effects in Kansas City as well as elsewhere. Think white flight, segregation academy, impoverished school districts, and more. The effects in society, politics, and education have preoccupied historians and lawyers, civil rights activists, politicians, educators, and more. But we don't have anywhere near as rich a picture of the effects of the court's school prayer decision. My talk this morning aims to fill that gap, situating both the practices of public prayer and the jurisprudence of prayer in broader religious and political history. Taking this wider view allows us to appreciate the extraordinary and long-lasting effects of the prayer decisions in American culture. A fine scholar of the Constitution once said of the Supreme Court that the justices had the extraordinary power not only to interpret history in the search for guiding principles to decide cases, but also the power to make history through its decisions. And indeed, the prayer cases have changed the ways we think and talk about religion in public life. Equally important, these decisions are vital to how we interpret secularism, the Constitution, and the actions of the Supreme Court. When the justices heard arguments on both sides of the school prayer controversy in late 1961, they learned how the regent's prayer came to be. A decade earlier, the New York State Board of Education had approved the 22-word prayer, making it the official prayer of the state school system across New York. Schools were encouraged but not required to adopt daily recitation of the prayer. And as you see, the prayer was hardly striking. Instead, it was short, non-denominational, and patriotic. You could even call it vapid. But it took months to write. It was designed explicitly to be unidentifiable and unremarkable. In 1950, New York commissioned the prayer from a group of priests, rabbis, and ministers. They all agreed on the language, draining it of religious specificity other than monotheism, and tying it directly to the nation. This was the mandate they'd been given: compose a prayer that was not offensive in religious terms to New Yorkers and that would encourage students to become respectful and responsible citizens. From that perspective, the prayer was successful. In theory, at least, A group of religious leaders representing the majority populations of the state had signed off on the prayer, so it could be trusted to be acceptable to everyone. It was the product of religious pluralism, not the imposition of a particular belief. Even Catholic leaders supported the proposal. This was a shift in policy. For more than a century, Catholics had been the reliable source of claims against religious exercises in schools. Not only that, but many Jews were reluctant to speak out against the prayer, especially because rabbis had been involved in the drafting. Gradually, the momentum grew in its favor, and it became part of New York's official educational policy in 1951. The Regent's prayer also fed into a brand new tradition, and I mean those quotes to be there, a tradition in American politics. After World War II, as the United States acquired pride of place at the head of one side of the Cold War, religious language appeared in new political venues. Just as the Regents Commission convened to draft their ecumenical prayer, the National Council of Churches, representing dozens of mainstream Protestant denominations, the National Association of Evangelicals, which included a range of fundamental as well as evangelical groups, all called for new recognition of the power of God in American history. The Pledge of Allegiance, they argued, should include the words "under God" to commemorate and cement the dependence of the country and its citizens on divine guidance and blessing. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower attended New York Presbyterian Church, where 2 years earlier he had been baptized, confirmed, and made a communicant of the church all in one day, only 3 weeks after he became president. The president's new religious commitment found expression in his support for the amended pledge. After listening to a sermon, you see the pastor there, by the Reverend George Doherty on the critical need for a reference to God in the National Creed, Eisenhower declared his endorsement. When Congress delivered a bill amending the pledge, the president signed it quickly, saying that the language, and here I'm quoting, reaffirmed the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future, and strengthened those spiritual weapons which will forever be our nation's most powerful resource in peace and war. This political rhetoric reflected anxiety as well as confidence. For one thing, educators and politicians were deeply concerned about an enormous crime wave after World War II. Conflict at home, then, was as undeniable as the threat from afar. Especially among young men, crime jumped almost 50% between 1948 and 1953. Gangs, with names like the Dragons and the Cobras, terrorized urban centers especially. And while all ethnicities participated in the violence, 2 out of 3 gang members in the 1950s and 60s are estimated by historians to have been African American or Hispanic, predominantly Puerto Rican. Numbers like this, just as an aside, point to how badly we need a focus on race and school prayer in history, a topic I am interested in and I hope others will be interested in working on too. But back to 1954. Newsweek in that year said that our vicious young hoodlums, as they called them, were on a crime spree that included random and apparently thoughtless violence, such as setting an innocent bystander, a man, on fire and killing him, and tying a 16-year-old girl to a tree after she had been stripped to the waist and whipping her. These young men raced in stolen cars, they terrorized schools, they raged through a society that, in response, turned to an increasingly militarized police, but also to prayer and religious counsel. In New York State, home to much of the most spectacular violence and also to powerful religious leaders, public educators reacted strongly. They did more than just endorse a prayer. They also created a full-grown program on moral and spiritual values for schools, based on the conviction that religious faith, and especially dependence on Almighty God, was the best security against the dangers, can you say these boys, of these difficult days. Religious consensus, that is, would provide a spiritual shield for Americans, and the Board of Regents would ensure that the divergent ways, as they put it, that New Yorkers worshiped God were reflected across their school day. So government officials not only composed prayers for school children, but an entire curriculum based on other shared spiritual values. In this sense, the consensus religion they were marketing was not the denial of religious diversity, but a celebration of it. The same ethic lay behind the embrace of the term Judeo-Christian that we heard last night in Professor Cohen's speech. And honestly, the same discomfort for many Jews. The label Judeo-Christian, at least in the late 1940s, was used to describe those who had opposed fascism and Nazism. And in that sense, the Judeo-Christian tradition had saved civilization, making religion a centerpiece not only of democracy, but of all humanity. Eisenhower put the point with his classic mix of, clarity and opaqueness in 1952. And here I'm quoting from him. "Our government," he said, "makes no sense unless it is founded in a deeply religious faith, and I don't care what it is." This quote is often presented without the following sentence, which makes his point much more clearly. He then said, "With us, of course, it is the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion that all men are created equal." It would be useless to discuss this religious ethic with a Russian, Eisenhower said, because all Russians had been taught that religion is an opiate of the people rather than a source of freedom and dignity. Americans knew the truth, that religion was the mainstay of democracy, even if politicians and educators couldn't really explain why that was so. For that, they needed scholars. The most powerful theologian of the mid-20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr, argued in his 1952 book, The Irony of American History, that Hebraic concepts, including covenantal community, a personal God, and historical revelation, were central to political democracy. These biblical concepts were also essential bulwarks against both atheistic communism, he said, and corrosive secular liberalism. And you might notice a new topic here, secularism. In the 1930s and 40s, secularism was widely associated with communism. But by the early 1950s, the appearance of secularism by itself in the list of enemies reflected the conviction that the new and frightening juvenile delinquents we saw a few minutes ago lacked all religious sensibility. It also resonated with growing concerns about materialism in a consumption-crazy society and the threat of science, which produced devastating weapons that could obliterate all humanity. In Niebuhr's view, tempering these threats was the job of the combined Judeo-Christian population of America. Only prophetic faith could ensure the survival of democracy against Marxists, scientists, hoodlums, and the totalitarianism that flowed from what he called their noxious creed. The most important Jewish proponent of this new tradition, Will Herberg, was a student of Niebuhr's, whose own early Marxism ended in disillusionment. When Herberg turned to religion in the 1940s, after reading Niebuhr's work, he contemplated conversion to Christianity. But Niebuhr surprised him by advising Herberg against it. Instead, he counsels Herberg, and here I'm quoting, to find God in his own religious heritage, because in Niebuhr's view, Judaism and Christianity shared vitally important commonalities that made each a key element in Western civilization. Herberg's response, especially in his well-known book, Protestant Catholic Jew, published in 1955, described the separate worlds of each faith, but concluded that these three religious cultures together formed a Jewish-Christian faith, one faith, that was the epicenter of American strength and resilience. The crusty underbelly of this unity within diversity, of course, was the tendency of Judeo-Christian defenders to overlook the real differences, especially between a majority Christian country and the many distinct minority American faiths. To say the obvious, it was at least awkward for Christian politicians and intellectuals to exploit Judaism in a country with its own history of Christian anti-Semitism, both distant and more recent. Think, for example, of Father Charles Coughlin, who embraced the elders of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and supported the Christian Front in the 30s, and eventually was indicted for a nebulous plot to destroy the Jews by the FBI. So despite Herberg's endorsement of the Jewish Christian faith, many Jewish commentators were wary. On the right-hand side there, you see Rabbi Bernard Heller, who in an article from the early 1950s called About the Judeo-Christian Tradition, argued that blending Judaism with Christianity was tantamount to denying the distinctiveness of the Jewish tradition and law. As he put it, Judaism refuses to accept the kiss of death. In truth, Bible reading and prayer had long been controversial in public education, even though Engel was the first case to reach the United States Supreme Court. In the 19th century, major urban centers banned such exercises in efforts to placate Catholics, and even in New York State, where the Regent's spiritual curriculum was widely touted in the 1950s, fewer than 1 in 5 school districts actually adopted the prayer. Most found that it was too incendiary, and they dropped it as a means of avoiding creating divisions within their communities. Many districts wound up including some other kind of ritual at the start of each school day. In New York City, for example, students sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee," pledged allegiance, and then listened to a scriptural passage recited without comment. This ceremony was viewed as productive, or at least tolerable, while the Regent's prayer was more divisive in practice than its authors ever anticipated. So let me step back a minute to talk about how scholars treat this period. Most studies of the unified religiosity of the 1950s tend to skip over the 1960s, at least the early part of it. One leading scholar of religion and politics in the 20th century noted that by the mid-1960s, twilight was beginning to settle over the Judeo-Christian, and by the early 1970s, he said the bloom was off the rose, and Americans embraced ethnic particularism so completely that even Christians began to see the use of the term Judeo-Christian might be an affront to Jews. But he never told us how that twilight came to be. And for the rest of my talk, I'd like to investigate the claim that the notion of an American Judeo-Christian tradition died after the early 1960s, and explain what happened. I hope to give us a sense that there is a vibrant sequel to that earlier era. Invocations of the Judeo-Christian tradition are alive and well, but they occur in a different atmosphere. Now they are part of a yawning divide between liberal and conservative religious and political leaders. Just to give you a teaser, future Republican candidate John McCain was attacked in 2007 for saying that the Constitution established the United States as a Christian nation. On the campaign trail in 2008, McCain turned to a more inclusive yet still conservative label. He shifted to saying that America was a Judeo-Christian valued nation. In 2009, President Obama said at a press conference in Turkey, sort of as just an offhand remark, that Americans might be majority Christian, and here I'm quoting now, but we do not consider ourselves a Christian nation or a Jewish nation or a Muslim nation. We consider ourselves a nation of citizens who are bound by ideals and a set of values. A firestorm erupted in Congress as a response. The Congressional Prayer Caucus went postal. In 2012, Mitt Romney repeatedly strove to convince evangelical Americans that he, like they, was a product of and a participant in what he called Judeo-Christian values. And now, Congressman Paul Ryan, a Tea Party hopeful Republican candidate for 2016, has made the Judeo-Christian nation a watchword for his political identity. So the Judeo-Christian notion is not dead, therefore, but it has acquired a distinctly Republican tinge. It may be that our country would eventually have divided over the notion that religious diversity in the country could be both described and venerated in a Judeo-Christian core consensus. But we will never know, because the Supreme Court, did the job of dividing us so thoroughly. In Engel against Vitale, the court announced that even the attempt to be inclusive was doomed, because those who had relied on the Judeo-Christian tradition to protect the country from the likes of Hitler and Stalin had mistaken their constitutional ground at home. Justice Hugo Black of Alabama, we'll meet the Alabama again later, wrote the majority of opinion for the court. Instead of focusing on recent history, he focused on a much different and arguably irrelevant past. In England, Black said, battles over the Book of Common Prayer, commissioned by the government and approved by Parliament in 1549, forced out dissenting Protestants who believed their faith would be compromised by the new rules. In this way, said Black, the Puritans of the 16th century took the first steps toward what would become the Puritan migration of the 17th century and the founding of New England. Unfortunately, these Puritans in their turn oppressed dissenters. You see here, these dissenters are getting ready to be burned and become martyrs. But, said Black, by the time of the Revolution, freedom-loving Americans had embraced separation of church and state. And here I'm quoting from Black. These people knew, some of them from bitter experience, that one of the greatest dangers to freedom of the individual to worship in his own way lay in the government's placing its official stamp of approval upon one particular kind of prayer or one particular form of religious service. So Black just skated over 400 years of Protestant history to reach the conclusion that in 1962, the Regent's Prayer was obviously unconstitutional. No matter how much the Interfaith Committee that wrote the prayer had struggled to ensure that it was inoffensive, its undeniably religious character and the fact that the government had commissioned it meant that it flew in the face of the Puritan ethic that had rebelled at the Book of Common Prayer and the American patriots who remembered that lesson and had written a constitution without an official religion of any sort. The Engel opinion produced a backlash of epic proportions. For those whose ecumenical convictions were at stake, the decision was a shock. Interfaith coalitions, such as the National Conference of Christians and Jews, believed that their work had created a template for how to conduct respectful and diverse religious services. They learned to their dismay that the Supreme Court could invoke history to undercut their work, even though most Americans then and now, I assume, had only the fuzziest idea of what happened in the English Reformation and didn't believe that it was akin in any meaningful way to their own experiences of faith or government. And by interpreting history and applying its lesson to the present day, the Supreme Court made history, not just in law, I would argue, but in religious life. The country reacted powerfully. Former Presidents Truman and Eisenhower condemned the decision. They were joined by the governor of New York and the governor and attorneys general of 38 other states. Polls found that 80% of Americans agreed with them. Some Protestant groups, however, pointed out that they had always opposed officially composed prayers. Religion, they said, was a more private matter. And President Kennedy tried to pour oil on the waves, assuring the country that they were still free to pray at home. Condemnation of the court apparently caught the justices by surprise. And even though he was not the author of the Engel opinion, Chief Justice Earl Warren took the brunt of the criticism. Calls for his impeachment rolled around the country. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina put his objection bluntly. The Supreme Court has held that God is unconstitutional, he said. One member of the House Un-American Activities Committee said that nothing could give more aid and comfort to Moscow than this bold, malicious, atheistic, and sacrilegious twist by this unpredictable group of despots. The despots are the Supreme Court justices. But before anybody had time to catch their breath, a second blow fell. In 1963, the Supreme Court was presented with two more cases, this time based not on a freshly composed prayer, but scripture read without comment at the start of the school day in one case and the recitation of the Lord's Prayer in the other. Now, court watchers have long seen a pattern. After a major change in law introduced by the Supreme Court, the next case will always engage in some backfilling and moderation in order to assure the country that there has not been a revolution and that things are much closer to the way they were. Not so in Abington School District against Schempp, as the consolidated cases were called. This time, Justice Tom Clark delivered the majority opinion. Bible reading and the Lord's Prayer were out on the same reasoning that doomed the Regent's Prayer. School children must not be forced into religious observance, even when nobody objects. The court's young-ish Catholic Justice, William Brennan, was more attuned to the ways that Engel had already landed like a bomb in American life. The length and breadth of his concurring opinion tried to soften the blow by outlining the many ways that religion might be an object of scholarly study. In his 90-page opinion, he stressed the holding that the court does not foreclose teaching about scriptures or about the differences between religions in classes in literature or history. Whether or not the Bible is involved, he said, it would be impossible to teach meaningfully many subjects in the social sciences or humanities without some mention of religion. But teaching about religion in this sense was not the same thing as teaching of religion, not the same thing as transmitting the faith to the next generation. And teaching about religion, thanks in significant part to this Schempp case, has become a staple of higher education. We here are products, we yammering at you now, are products of this shift. Early on, scholars like those of us talking to you today credited Schempp for the birth and flourishing of the field we now know as religious studies. As scholars understood the Schempp case, they could teach but not preach, as one scholar put it to me recently. Religious studies departments dedicated to the teaching about religion according to secular standards sprouted even at state universities. In 1964, just to hammer home the connection between Schempp and religious studies, the main professional scholarly organization for the teaching of religion in higher education changed its name. It had been the National Association of Bible Instructors, and now it became the American Academy of Religion. Students of religion embraced these secular standards for excellence in research, analysis, and writing. But the Schempp opinion did more than just propel the formation of a new academic field. It also acted more broadly on society, driving the fear of secularism into panic mode. Now, even those Protestants who had accepted Engel were stunned to find that the court had embraced their brand of separation of church and state. The fragile consensus that had sustained the theory of a religiously unified populace that nonetheless respected diversity, that consensus evaporated. In this sense, it's fair to say that if there ever was a civil religion in America, its lifespan was both short and tumultuous. The Supreme Court and the divisions within religious life that were revealed by the prayer and Bible reading cases mortally wounded any attempt to view this public religion in nonpartisan or nonsectarian terms. By the mid-1960s, the rhetoric of public religion had shifted to nostalgia, regret, and anger. The results have been an ever-increasing politicization of religion in public life. Here, I want to emphasize that it is not the case that the Regent's Prayer was written and approved and recited outside politics, but it was conceived as a unifying and solemnizing enterprise, one that drew the American people in by welcoming all faiths, treating them together rather than splintering them. We may disagree about whether the enterprise was ever wise or came close to achieving its goals, but there can be no doubt that the Supreme Court's bombshells unleashed a backlash that has changed religious life and political history. The influential evangelist Billy Graham set the tone for the chorus. "God pity our country," he said in 1963. "God pity our country when we can no longer appeal to God for help." Baptists, in particular, had a long-standing mistrust of anything that smacked of government interference in religion. In the South, and especially in white Baptist strongholds there, the effects of the combined decisions appears most starkly. In the 2 decades after World War II, the white South went from being a separate, self-identified, and largely isolated region, as we know from the great work of Professor Dochuk, to a much more politically, culturally, and especially religiously integrated part of the nation. Southerners had already been instructed that Jim Crow was a violation of constitutionally mandated equality between the races. Now they confronted painful lessons in what seemed like a forcible imposition of secularism at the hands of the justices. One congressman from Alabama even quipped that Earl Warren had brought the Negroes into Southern schools, and now the same man had kicked God out. And indeed, Engel and Schempp drove a wedge between those who had long understood themselves as supporters of church and state. Many were and still are deeply distrustful of the Supreme Court's heavy hand, but others, groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Jewish Committee, the Unitarian Church, and even most of the National Council of Churches, felt empowered by the winds. They and their descendants have continued to litigate, claiming that the Constitution is on their side. Often, a victory has produced celebration among those inside this coalition of strict separationists. But the winner-take-all atmosphere has imposed enormous costs politically and culturally, especially for those who still feel frozen out of a country they believe once welcomed their faiths and that once endorsed their public expression of patriotism in religious terms. As this latter group grasped the potential for political organizing along religious principles and connected the battle for the schools to the defense of God's nation against secularism, Southern Protestants especially met Catholics on the battlefield. But now they met them as allies, or at least not as antagonists. The divide was so deep that it also affected American Jews, who had long dreaded school prayer, even if most Jewish leaders counseled their members that lawsuits over the issue were likely to result in terrible losses for the plaintiffs and ugly, ugly anti-Semitism just for daring to object. But after Engel, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America condemned the exclusion of religion from public life. The alienation between liberal movements within Judaism and the Orthodox has been long-lived and bitter, and ranges over issues such as the constitutionality of the erection of eruvs starting in the early 1980s. Hempstead, Long Island, has long been a hotbed for such tension, as the website Jewish People Opposed to the Eruv explains. Other conflicts on college campuses, such as the case known as the Yale Four, pitted ultra-Orthodox students against both universities and liberal Jewish students on campuses in the 1990s. Today, conservative Catholics, including an organization called the Becket Fund, support ultra-Orthodox claims, including the right to separate seating for men and women on New York City buses, allowing Orthodox merchants to refuse to serve anyone dressed in shorts or with a low neckline, and arguing that matzah bakers should be allowed to drill their own wells in violation of city ordinances to use groundwater required in kosher baking. These battles are growing in volume and acrimony, affecting the outcomes of election in New York for city council and even mayor, and pitting Jews against each other in public ways unheard of 50 years ago. In this sense, the new religious right was a coalition born in resistance to a blasphemous Supreme Court, 9 despotic old men in Washington who imposed godlessness on the entire country. Sermons against the dangers of secularism poured out of pulpits across the country. Soon, supporters of Barry Goldwater's presidential bid in 1964 and Ronald Reagan's 1966 gubernatorial campaign in California made the political connections plain. They painted the ban on prayer as a forcible imposition of moral relativism and blamed the court for the erosion of patriotism and the sexual revolution, you might as well toss it in, right, that rocked the country in the mid and late 1960s. In fact, though, the Supreme Court has a checkered record on public prayer. For legislatures, the court upheld formal but non-sectarian prayers in the mid-1980s, saying, another history lesson, that Congress had hired a chaplain in the same week that it approved the Establishment Clause and sent the Bill of Rights out to the states for ratification. And they said grown-ups can be trusted to distinguish between non-sectarian prayers delivered to legislatures and children who were pressured to pray at school. So there's one rule for grown-ups and another rule for kids. Even this attempt at mollifying those who accuse the court of imposing a religion of secularism has run into trouble, though. In a case called Town of Greece against Galloway, the Supreme Court heard an appeal in November 2013 from a decision from the New York federal courts. In that case, the town council's monthly meeting opened with prayer, and each and every prayer was Christian for 10 years, often using explicitly Christian language such as, "He died for us," "In Jesus' name we pray," and "Our Savior," and so on. So the controversy doesn't go away. And in part, it's stoked by those divisions. And I want to get back to them. In 1979, the Southern Baptist Convention, long known for its vocal support of separationism, changed course. Southern Baptists generally supported the concept of separation of church and state through the mid-1960s, but gradually they absorbed the truth. Their own sense of the religious nature of the country had been forever undermined by the Supreme Court. Over time, they became opponents of the very separatist organizations they had long viewed as allies, and school prayer was a precipitating cause of the split. The process took more than a decade, but in the centuries-long life of Baptists in America, the change was precipitous. In a move known as the conservative takeover, the convention embraced a new commitment to biblical inerrancy, patriarchal authority within the family, and other tools of defense against materialism, communism, and secularism. The leaders of the takeover founded the Moral Majority the next year and popularized the idea that secular humanists now controlled universities, the liberal media, trade unions, and the Ford Foundation. Soon, the notion that separation of church and state had ever been central to faithful Americans disappeared. One outgrowth of the new coalition, a group called Concerned Women for America, grew to be the largest women's group in the country within a few years of its founding. They were and are dedicated to prayer as a means of ensuring God's grace for America, and they oppose all kinds of secularism. They reject separationism so thoroughly that they coached members on how to answer hard-hitting questions in the 1980s, such as, "Don't you believe in separation of church and state?" The answer was, quote, "Nowhere in the Constitution of the United States does the phrase separation of church and state exist. It is only in the USSR Constitution." Technically correct. And although they get less media attention, and here I'm winding up, the religious left was also galvanized by public prayer. The advocacy group called Americans United for Separation of Church and State is not a secular organization. It was founded in the 1940s explicitly as a Protestant group with the awkward name Protestants and Other Americans United for Separation of Church and State. The school prayer cases divided this organization as it did so many others. Many of those who had been staunch supporters urged the group to oppose the court and defend prayer. Instead, the group embraced the decisions and lost the majority of their membership over the next several years. But they found new friends among Unitarians, liberal Jews, Buddhists, atheists, agnostics, and even some mainline Protestants in the North. To reflect this new audience, the group had a liberal revolution that matched the Southern Baptist conservative one. They changed their name to reflect this new audience, dropping the Protestant label, but they still view their mission as a religious one and strict separation as a vital means of protecting religious freedom. Their long-term executive director, Barry Lynn, is an ordained Congregationalist minister. So what are we to take from 50 years of conflict? One lesson is that the Supreme Court turned what had been persistent disagreement over prayer at the local level into a national controversy. This is a pattern across American history, even though I think too many religious historians miss it. Alexis de Tocqueville's 2-volume Democracy in America, and I'm sorry that quality isn't great on the left-hand side, has become a standard reference tool for scholars. Tocqueville pointed out in the 1830s that every moral issue in America sooner or later winds up in a courtroom because Americans trust their legal system above all else. I have to tell you, he also said that lawyers are America's natural aristocracy, but usually I only say that to audiences of attorneys or aspiring law students. But Tocqueville's observation is still true today. Americans, yes, are religious, but they are also litigious. The two go hand in hand. 'Twas ever thus, even in Puritan New England, like slavery, civil rights, the outcome of contested presidential elections, gay marriage, Obamacare, and other issues of great moment in American history. The law of prayer and public religion has changed the way we think about faith in America. And this law has deeply divided the country in ways we still feel. To give you one last example, I told you we'd come back to Alabama. This past Monday, the Alabama legislature voted out of committee a bill to require school teachers to recite prayers every morning at the beginning of school. As an outraged Americans United blog post put it, and here I'm quoting, proponents of this bill have tried to create the illusion of constitutionality by specifying that the prayers must be the same ones delivered by the chaplain to the Congress in Washington. Get it? In other words, they're trying to merge the rule for grown-ups with the rule for kids in a move calculated to provoke a lawsuit. One commentator on a news story about the legislators' action put it just yesterday, "Our Father," here I'm quoting the Post, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Please hear our prayers, O Lord, and open the eyes and hearts and minds of our so-called leaders, that they may know that the laws which they doth try to pass are unconstitutional per se. Lord, we beseech thee, send them a sign, to wit, copies of the Supreme Court opinions in Engel against Vitale and Abington School District against Schempp." So you see, 50 years later, these cases still influence political life, sucking up the time and energy of legislatures, voters, and surely judges. There is no end in sight to the conflict, but I know you will be pleased to hear that we have reached the end of my talk this morning. Thank you so much for listening.